Last week, the Vatican followed through on a promise it had made to release what I and now some others are referring to as the Uncle Ted novel, a work of fiction that purports to tell the story of how the former cardinal turned layman, that we have dubbed Uncle Ted, was permitted to have the influence on the church and the world that he was able to. It's a novel because it does two things: places the responsibility for Uncle Ted virtually anywhere and everywhere except with Francis, and it doesn't mention James Grine even one time. Mr. Grine, as you'll recall, had rather close access to Uncle Ted, having seen firsthand his work throughout the years and having been the recipient of the work that would characterize Uncle Ted himself. Dr. Taylor Marshall had a landmark interview with Mr. Grine in 2018 or 2019 that is worth your time if you're not familiar with him. The point of the Uncle Ted novel was not to provide the story of Uncle Ted that was rooted in reality. It was to tell a story about Francis, to clear the way for his ongoing work, and, most importantly, to finally enable Francis to answer Archbishop Vigano. Remember, little if anything has ever been said by Rome in response to the work of Archbishop Vigano since 2018. The McCarrick novel serves as that answer, and in that document, Vigano is mentioned 306 times, compared to the 153 times Francis is mentioned by name. That sure says a lot, and chiefly it says that the document isn't so much about Uncle Ted, it's about Archbishop Vigano. Vigano issued first a short response to the letter, and then a longer response in the form of an interview on EWTN with Raymond Arroyo. It's a must-see interview if you haven't seen it yet, especially with all that is going on in the city of Man and Caesar at the moment. The report offers little clarity about essential questions, including where did Uncle Ted get his resources from? The National Catholic Register provides an example of this issue when examining his illicit use of charitable funds to cover the costs related to a situation in Metuchen while he was the Archbishop of Newark. The amount in question was $10,000, and no records exist of where it came from. The novel says in several places that Uncle Ted did not draw diocesan salary or pension. A layman who ended up reviewing his records in Washington told the Vatican that the former cardinal never showed any income from the diocese at all. In fact, his apparent lack of ordinary income raises the possibility that funds under his control and raised for charitable purposes were used to take care of his own issues. In other words, he used his official resources for his own purposes, and all that entails. That whole situation is but one example of what this novel doesn't do, which is to shed light on a situation begging for sunlight. Phil Lawler describes the absurdity of the Uncle Ted novel in this way, quote, "From the start of his episcopal career, Ted became a world traveler. During a relatively brief stint as Bishop of Metuchen, New Jersey, he found time to travel to England, Ireland, Austria, Poland twice, Israel, India, Tunisia, Santo Domingo, Sudan, Egypt, Morocco, Malta, Southeast Asia, and at least 6 times to Rome. At every stop, no doubt, he was advancing his own interests. How are those trips serving the ordinary faithful of Metuchen?" End quote. Lawler goes on to describe how Ted was legendary with his skills at gathering resources for the Vatican. Now, he regularly provided fungible gifts to other prelates. The novel tells readers, and asks them to take it on faith, that these customary gifts are not an important part of the story. Lawler points out that there is no Vatican prelate on record saying anything about this or praising him for his generosity as part of his recommendation to become an archbishop or cardinal, for clear reasons. This entire aspect of Ted's work is simply not in the novel. Instead, we get a lot about Vigano, far more than would be warranted unless this novel is really about Vigano. One of the unresolved questions about Uncle Ted is his access to resources and what he did with them. I recall from the James Grine interview with Dr. Marshall that Grine said Ted had always had access to resources as far back as he remembered him, and that Ted had baptized Grine when he was an infant, well before he was a bishop, and had been part of his family life ever since. Yet no mention of him in the novel. He also reported that Uncle Ted took a life-changing trip to Switzerland, to a town whose name would become synonymous with a group of men who were trying to change the direction of the church to what we see today. No mention of them either. In fact, it is this that Vigano zeroes in on in his interview with EWTN's Raymond Arroyo, pointing out to the very fact that this omission is telling, that Uncle Ted has been part of that group since he was young, and it was that group who, after John Paul II passed, and again after Benedict retired, would try in both instances to direct the conclave and the selection of the next pontiff, ultimately being successful in 2013. Vigano describes it in such a way that makes clear that he believes this attempt was anything but in keeping with the norms of the conclave, though he doesn't explicitly say it. Vigano goes on to point out that the attempt to place Uncle Ted at the feet of John Paul II and Benedict XVI is disingenuous, as it doesn't factor in the influence of a cardinal that most of you are probably not familiar with, Cardinal Sodano, who had been Uncle Ted's champion, overseeing and influencing his promotions throughout his career. But Sodano was known for far more than that. He helped Maciel and others in similar situations to keep their work from being known in the Vatican. If you've read about Maciel, you'll see something familiar. The stories that have turned Uncle Ted's name into a metaphor for a larger issue, as well as his prolific gift-giving access to the most influential members of the Roman Curia. Maciel did that stuff too. If you were to take Maciel's name out of the stories about him and replace them with Uncle Ted's, they'd be nearly indistinguishable. Both men were cut from the same cloth, and both men were close to Cardinal Sodano, who retired last year after Francis reinvigorated his career in Rome. Sodano was the missing key to all of this, and nary a mention of him is made in the novel, other than in neutral or positive tones. One instance stands out as a good example. That of in 2000 when Cardinal Sodano met with Ted in New York to tell him he still had the friendship of John Paul II. Sodano is made into a message bearer that aids in placing Ted at the feet of John Paul II, and no mention is made of his own involvement in all of this, just references to meetings that he had with Ted and Ratzinger and others. But his real role is just not there. Curious, isn't it? When he is mentioned, it isn't simply another name among names, another important cardinal that Ted worked with. Nothing else. Odd, isn't that? I could go on and on. I recommend you check out the Vigano interview on the EWTN YouTube channel if you can. Raymond Arroyo and he really dive deep into this document. It sheds light on what the novel is really about. It has a plot that is complex and Hugo Award worthy. It just isn't remotely rooted in reality because, as I said last week, Francis is the hero of the story, and few seem to know that he, Sodano, and Uncle Ted all worked together at two conclaves that resulted in his becoming Pope finally in 2024. Then it can lead to some conclusions about Francis that are simply not on the table at this time. Let me know what you think of this story. If any of you have access to the Hugo Awards, maybe put in a nomination for this book for Best Fantasy Novel of 2020. It's that well put together. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, please, and please pray for the church. And if you haven't listened to the response, or recording rather, of Vigano's initial response to the Uncle Ted novel, I recorded it and have a link to it in the show notes for today, so go check that out. The show notes are posted over at returntotradition.org. That way you can always find them in the future regardless of how things go. Anyway, check that out. I do suggest it. Ave Maria.